We all eventually have to come to terms with the idea of dying. Whether we've lost loved ones or had brushes with it ourselves, passing away is an inescapable part of living. And whether we have found peace regarding it or continue to deny it, the reality of mortality can be a terrifying idea when given physical manifestation. This unstoppable specter of encroaching mortality is brought to life in writer and director David Robert Mitchell's 2015 horror film, It Follows. From its unplaceable setting to its oblique but relatable characters to its monstrous extrapolation of slasher film conventions, Mitchell's movie is a rumination on the slow realization of one's own mortality and the inevitability of death. This is a coming-of-age film crossed with a horror story, which disturbs in ways that linger due to the relatable essence of its far-fetched premise. It Follows focuses on Jay, a college student played by Micah Monroe, pursued by a monstrous entity after having sex with a guy who quickly lets her know that he's passed a curse onto her. This strange entity, which can look like anyone and can only be seen by those who have received the sexually transmitted curse, will walk after her until she passes it on to someone else.
You can get rid of it, okay? Just sleep with someone as soon as you can. Just pass it along.
If it catches up to you, it will kill you, and then proceed to pursue the last person who is afflicted. Slowly coming to realize the truth of her newfound danger, Jay and her friends must figure out how to survive this unflinching, seemingly unstoppable manifestation of death. This core conflict is the essence of the slasher film, given such direct, one-to-one translation that it loops all the way back around to being metaphorical. And after its release, the meaning of the monster of It Follows was subject to numerous interpretations. With its sexually transmitted nature, critics have seen it as a discussion regarding the tragedy of AIDS and other STIs, as well as anxieties around sexual intimacy. Its strange location and lack of exact place and time, with its 80s aesthetic punctuated by the use of a strange shell phone, have caused some to interpret it as a nightmare brought on by teenage angst. And while Mitchell intentionally sought to remove realistic grounding in It Follows to create a dreamlike atmosphere, that doesn't make the film literally someone's dream. When moving away from specificity and oversimplification, we can view It Follows as a broader story regarding mortality and coming to terms with our inevitable ends. While the film takes place in and around Detroit, its time and world seem to not belong to any specific home in America. And if anything, Mitchell frames the town to feel like Haddonfield, Illinois, from John Carpenter's Halloween, rather than Michigan at the end of summer. It's one of many homages to classic slashers without being bogged down in references. The most specific one being the connection of sex and death, a cliché found throughout the slasher subgenre. In It Follows, physical intimacy becomes the pivot point to adulthood in the most literal manner possible by being what brings the creature's curse.
I had this image of myself holding hands with a really cute guy, listening to the radio, driving along some pretty road, up north maybe. And the trees started to change colors.
And accompanying Jay's transition into adulthood comes the disappearance of other adult figures who could provide her some semblance of safety. Parents are seen less often than a Peanuts cartoon. Police have a presence but not any real importance. School happens but doesn't shape the narrative. Jay and her friends have been pushed into adulthood and must figure this out on their own.
I'm scared. Me too. We'll figure it out. You can't tell Mom. Because she'll freak out and she won't believe me. I know. It's okay.
These are all impressions of everyday life without actual connections to how the story plays out. In doing so, it seems as if Mitchell was intent on creating a setting that felt immediately familiar, but lacking details and realities that are only apparent upon reflection, like a nightmare that feels preposterous once you've woken up and thought about it. In regards to how he views the worlds he makes in film, Mitchell stated, "Film doesn't have to operate within the world we live in. The ground rules of the film world don't have to be how we understand the world. And something doesn't have to be fantasy to take elements from fantasy. Movies are very much dreams in a way, and you can use that to your advantage. The audience takes their understanding of everyday life and horror tropes and impresses them on the setting, and the same can be said of the characters. By and large, the viewer's own fears of death can be projected upon the cast of characters and their encounters with the monster because Mitchell encouraged vagaries within the film he made. At most, Mitchell's characters are sketches, providing Jay and her friends with general motivations and a relatability without very many defining characteristics. However, the film avoids making them disposable fodder for the monster, like most cookie-cutter teen-centered horror movies. Actually, the deaths of It Follows are few and far between. Jay is a typical college student, with a boring home and a group of friends trying to manage their everyday lives, until they're suddenly interrupted by the monster at the film's center. Thankfully, Mitchell's dialogue isn't contrived, feeling more like everyday conversations and balancing out its elemental slasher structure.
Who is he? Somebody new.
Of course.
Your sister's so pretty, it's annoying. It is annoying.
Well, at least she's nice.
Mitchell also devotes very little time to establishing relationships and backstory, implying them more often than straight out stating them. The most important of these relationships being the one between Jay and longtime friend Paul, who grow closer together but are still separated by Jay's confrontation with mortality. Because only Jay can see the monster due to her curse, she remains inherently disconnected from Paul, who can't totally understand what she's going through. When combining this narrative of distorted young adulthood with Mike Joulakis' ethereal cinematography, the film strikes a balance between feeling like you've been dropped into the middle of someone's everyday life and floating through a nightmare from which you cannot wake. From its start, Mitchell and Joulakis employ lingering, roaming shots, scanning the surroundings and providing as much space around their characters as possible through the use of wide-angle lenses. While these cinematic choices naturally create a sense of unease from the very beginning, it's only upon the realization of the creature's nature that we completely understand their motivation. The monster may have been in any of these scenes, but it is only as Jay understands that it could be anywhere and look like anyone that the audience becomes as alert as the character. And these expansive shots combine with the nature of the creature to push audiences to constantly scan the screen in search of anyone who could be it. Meanwhile, camera movements forcibly shift audience perception to what may or may not be the monster. Additionally, composer Disasterpeace's score provides even greater lurking dread through its ethereal synths. It also provides sonic ties to the 80s and the works of John Carpenter to complement the visual style. By putting viewers in the same headspace as Jay, we too become paranoid and experience similar dread and fear. And while the dangers of the creature are quickly shown in the film, its unrelenting and violent nature is spelled out more and more as the film progresses. Most often, the figures taken by the creature are shown in a state of undress, further connecting them to their sexually transmitted origin and perverting the sense of intimacy and vulnerability typically associated with such an appearance. However, the monster is almost entirely depicted in wide shots, keeping viewers at a distance and leaving the creature unknowable, in a manner very similar to how Michael Myers was framed in the original Halloween. That is, save for one of Jay's earliest encounters, where the female form of the being is shown in slow-motion ultra close-up, emphasizing the perverse nature of its human imitation and allowing the impressions from this depiction to be placed on all future appearances. It, whatever it truly is, operates very much in the mode of a classic slasher villain. Consider the well-worn tropes of the genre. A victim falls prey to a killer who, no matter what, walks at a slow but methodical pace toward them, and somehow always seems to catch up. Nothing can stop them, and their true nature is almost impossible to fully comprehend. Most often, these killers go after sexually promiscuous characters, whether that is their actual motivation as a villain or simply a modus operandi that aligns with the traditions of the genre. The rules of a slasher film are simple, if bendable.
Number one, you can never have sex. No. Big no-no, big no.
I'm a dead man.
Even popcorn. Sex equals death, okay? Number two, you can never drink or do drugs. No, the sin factor. It's a sin. It's an extension of number one.
The inherent morality clauses within this subsection of horror are present throughout the heyday of slashers in the 1980s, and only the morally upright, often chaste, final girl is left standing by the end. These ideas are all present in their most literal sense within It Follows, as sex is what causes the creature to pursue Jay. Anyone who is not sexually active literally cannot see the monster, and is therefore largely exempt from its focus. But rather than applying the typical slasher structure of having the heroine's friends slowly killed off throughout the film, It Follows becomes so strict in its rules that no one who abstains is ever in any real peril, further isolating Jay from her friends and putting her into a continual showdown with death that lasts the entire movie. And because Jay is one of the few in danger, there really isn't any moral clauses attached to her survival. It's simply the nature of her maturation as a woman. Jay starts as the final girl. It isn't a third act title given to her, and in continually confronting the realities of death, Jay is forced to grow up. The confrontation with mortality may be eased through the help of loved ones, but is ultimately an individual's burden to bear. Here in its climax, as Jay and friends attempt to kill the creature once and for all, Mitchell gives us one last layer in this meditation on death. While never explicitly stated, the shape the monster takes in the finale is that of Jay's father, only seen in Polaroids scattered throughout her home. Did he leave? Is Jay's father dead? It's possible that the loss of her dad has long affected her home life, and here, now entering adulthood herself, Jay is forced to confront the specter of her father, much like how the creature took the form of Greg's mother before killing him. Like the Greek myth of Orestes, perhaps the symbolic killing of the parent is the only way for a child to step into adulthood and become their own person. Much has been said of how the protagonist's final plan of lure the creature into a pool and electrocute it is obviously a bad idea, and how their seeming victory, which comes from shooting it in the head while it's in the pool, could not possibly truly kill the creature. After all, they already shot it earlier in the film and it came right back. To some degree, it's a completely valid criticism. The film never explicitly tells us that this is a fool's errand, or that their victory was short-lived. However, the immature, poorly thought-out plan of action can be seen as a reflection of the character's own immaturity. After all, characters making mistakes does not a plot hole make. By its end, what Jay and friends believe to be victory is hinted at being merely temporary relief, as can be inferred from a figure walking behind our leads at the film's end. In any case, accepting the realities of death results in Jay and Paul beginning a relationship, allowing the act of sex to become one of intimacy rather than a transaction or curse. Here, in the shadow of death and across the threshold of adulthood, Jay must accept a life very much aware of her own inevitable death.
And the most terrible agony may not be in the wounds themselves, but in knowing for certain that within an hour, then within 10 minutes, then within half a minute, and now, at this very instant, your soul will leave your body and you will no longer be a person. And that this is certain. The worst thing is that it is certain.
Jay, Paul, and their friends may have grown up somewhat by the conclusion of It Follows and have recognized their undeniable mortality, a far cry from the seeming immortality of the teenage years. But death is inevitable for us all, no matter how mature, wise, or jaded we become.